She lay motionless in that sterile hospital bed, silver hair scattered across the pillow, age spots decorating her trembling hands. To everyone at Massachusetts General Hospital, Margaret Hawthorne was just another elderly patient, confused, vulnerable, harmless. But when Nurse Rebecca Chen reached into that bedside drawer and stole what she thought was an easy score, she made a catastrophic miscalculation. Because the frail woman in room 347 wasn't just a retired librarian from Beacon Hill, she was a ghost, a weapon wrapped in wrinkled skin. For 30 years, Margaret Hawthorne operated in the shadows of the Cold War as one of the CIA's most lethal psychological operatives, trained in a classified technique so devastating it could dismantle governments without firing a single bullet. The HONEYTRAP protocol, a method of social manipulation so precise, so invisible, that victims never even knew they were being destroyed until it was far too late. And now, in this Boston hospital, that protocol was about to be activated again. Within 72 hours, Nurse Chen would find herself isolated, discredited, and surrounded by enemies she never made, trapped in a web she couldn't see, all orchestrated by a woman who never even left her hospital bed. The question isn't whether you steal from a sleeping lion. The question is, what happens when that lion has spent 3 decades learning exactly how to destroy you? Welcome to a story where age is the perfect disguise, where the most dangerous people are the ones you underestimate, and where one act of theft triggers a masterclass in psychological warfare. How does a 67-year-old grandmother systematically dismantle someone's entire life using nothing but words, timing, and 30 years of espionage training? Stay with us, because what you're about to witness will change everything you thought you knew about power, manipulation, and the art of invisible revenge. Margaret Hawthorne had learned long ago that hospitals smelled the same in every country: antiseptic, floor polish, and desperation. The Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston was no different. As she lay in the bed of room 347, watching the autumn rain streak down the windows overlooking the Charles River, she catalogued every detail with the muscle memory of decades spent in hostile territory. The shift changes happened at 7 in the morning and 7 at night. The security cameras had blind spots near the supply closets. The weekend skeleton crew was understaffed by at least 30%. Old habits never died, they just pretended to sleep. Margaret was 67 now, with silver hair she wore in a practical bun, deep brown eyes that still missed nothing, and hands marked by age spots and arthritis that wasn't entirely an act. She'd been admitted 3 days ago after what the doctors called a significant fall in her Beacon Hill townhouse. Fractured hip, possible concussion, mandatory observation. The truth was messier. She'd been reaching for a book on the top shelf, a first edition Graham Greene she'd bought in Vienna in 1983, back when she was someone else entirely, and her body had simply betrayed her in a way no enemy ever had. Getting old was the one mission she couldn't win. Her room overlooked the hospital's main courtyard, where early November had stripped the trees bare. Boston was experiencing one of those grey, cold autumns that made everyone move a little faster, heads down against the wind coming off the harbour. Margaret had lived in this city for 5 years now, ever since she'd officially retired from a career the government still pretended never existed. 30 years as a field operative for the Central Intelligence Agency. 30 years of legends, covers, and identities. 30 years of being whoever she needed to be to get whatever information her country required. She'd been Rebecca Sullivan in Moscow, Catherine Winters in Berlin, Marie Duchamp in Paris. Dozens of names, dozens of lives, each one carefully constructed and just as carefully destroyed when the mission ended. But her specialty, the thing that made her valuable enough to survive in a world where female operatives were still treated as exotic experiments, was something the agency had codenamed the HONEYTRAP protocol. Most people heard HONEYTRAP and thought of seduction, of beautiful women luring men into compromising positions. That was amateur hour. Margaret's protocol was far more sophisticated. It was social engineering raised to an art form. It was understanding that every human being existed within a web of relationships, reputation, and perceived trustworthiness, and that web could be manipulated with surgical precision if you knew where to pull the threads. She'd used it to turn a KGB colonel's entire department against him in 48 hours. She'd used it to make a corrupt defense minister in South America so paranoid he fled his own country. She'd used it to dismantle a terrorist network by making them believe their leader was an informant. All without violence, all without ever being suspected. Just words, timing, and an understanding of human psychology that most people couldn't comprehend. And now she was in a hospital bed in Boston, reduced to pressing a call button when she needed to use the bathroom. The door opened, and Nurse Rebecca Chen entered with the practiced efficiency of someone running through a mental checklist. Rebecca was 32, Chinese-American, with sharp features and sharper ambitions that showed in the tight set of her mouth and the way she moved. Always calculating, always measuring. Margaret had been observing her for 3 days now. Rebecca was competent but overworked, picking up extra shifts, always volunteering for overtime. Financial pressure, most likely. The slight fray on her scrubs, the smartphone with a cracked screen, the way she eyed the designer purses other nurses carried, all data points. "Good evening, Mrs. Hawthorne," Rebecca said, checking the IV line with barely a glance at Margaret's face. "How are we feeling?" "Oh, a bit foggy still, dear," Margaret replied, letting her voice quaver just slightly. She'd cultivated this persona carefully, the confused elderly woman, the kind everyone underestimated, the kind people stopped really seeing after a while. "I can't quite remember. Did my son visit today, or was that yesterday?" Rebecca didn't look up from the chart. "You don't have any visitors listed in your file, Mrs. Hawthorne." "Oh." Margaret let confusion cloud her features. "That's strange. I could have sworn—" It was a performance, but a necessary one. Over 3 days, she'd established herself as slightly confused, occasionally forgetful, and utterly harmless. The staff had stopped being quite so attentive. They spoke over her sometimes as if she were furniture. It was exactly what she wanted. Rebecca finished her checks and turned to leave, but not before her eyes flickered to the bedside drawer, where Margaret kept her personal items. A leather wallet, reading glasses, a worn paperback. Margaret saw the look, fast, calculating, hungry. She'd seen that look before in 100 different contexts, on 100 different faces. It was the look of someone considering an opportunity. "Will you be sleeping soon, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Rebecca asked, pausing at the door. "Oh, yes, dear. They gave me something that makes me so drowsy I can barely keep my eyes open." Margaret let her eyelids droop for effect. "Sleep well," Rebecca said, and closed the door. Margaret waited, staring at the ceiling, her breathing slow and even. 20 minutes passed. 30. She heard the medication cart rolling down the hallway, the distant ping of the elevator, the low murmur of the nurse's station at the end of the hall. Then, just after midnight, when the corridor was quietest, she heard it, the soft click of her door opening. She kept her breathing steady, eyes closed, body relaxed. Through her eyelashes, she watched Rebecca enter, moving with practiced silence toward the bedside table. The nurse's hand reached into the drawer, fingers closing around the leather wallet. Margaret watched her slip it into the deep pocket of her scrubs. The whole thing took less than 15 seconds. Rebecca paused, looking down at Margaret's face, checking for any sign of awareness. Margaret gave her nothing, just the steady breathing of deep sleep, the slight flutter beneath her eyelids that suggested dreaming. Satisfied, Rebecca turned and left as quietly as she'd come. Margaret opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling. She felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years of retirement. Not anger. Anger was unprofessional, a luxury she'd never been able to afford. No, what she felt was the old machinery clicking into gear, synapses firing in patterns she'd thought were dormant. The wallet had contained $73, a debit card, her driver's license, and a library card. Nothing irreplaceable, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Rebecca Chen had made a critical error in judgment. She'd seen a vulnerable elderly woman and assumed helplessness. She'd mistaken age for weakness, confusion for incompetence. In Margaret's former life, those kinds of assumptions got people killed. Here they would simply get Rebecca Chen destroyed. Margaret closed her eyes again, but this time she wasn't pretending to sleep. She was planning. The HONEYTRAP protocol existed in phases. Phase 1. Assessment. She'd been doing that for 3 days, mapping the social dynamics of this hospital floor. She knew that Rebecca was ambitious but disliked by some of the senior nurses for her eagerness to work overtime. It made them look bad. She knew that Dr. Rashid, the attending physician, was a stickler for protocol and had reprimanded Rebecca twice for minor charting errors. She knew that the head nurse, Carol Martinez, was protective of the patients and had a zero-tolerance policy for anything that threatened their well-being. Phase 2. Positioning. Tomorrow she would begin laying groundwork. Small comments, carefully placed. Nothing direct. That was amateur work. Just little observations, innocent questions. The kind of things confused elderly patients said that seemed meaningless but planted seeds. Phase 3. Acceleration. She'd create situations where Rebecca's behavior appeared suspicious, where small inconsistencies would be noticed. The beauty of the protocol was that Margaret would never make a direct accusation. She'd simply create an environment where other people would start noticing patterns, asking questions, drawing their own conclusions. Phase 4. Isolation. Once doubt was planted, it would spread organically. Rebecca would find herself facing skepticism, increased scrutiny, social coldness from colleagues who were just responding to a vague sense that something was off. Phase 5. Collapse. The target, isolated and defensive, would typically make mistakes, become paranoid, alienate the few allies they had left. The web would tighten until there was nowhere left to turn. Margaret had executed this protocol 17 times in her career, across 4 continents, in contexts ranging from foreign intelligence services to terrorist organizations. A hospital in Boston would be child's play. But even as she planned, a small voice in the back of her mind, the voice that sounded like her daughter Emily, who hadn't spoken to her in 12 years, whispered a question she didn't want to hear. Was this really necessary? Was destroying a nurse's career proportional to the theft of $73? Margaret silenced that voice with practiced efficiency. Rebecca Chen had made a choice. She'd chosen to steal from someone she perceived as powerless. That revealed character, revealed the kind of person who would exploit the vulnerable when she thought there would be no consequences. People like that needed to learn there were always consequences. Or at least, that's what Margaret told herself as she finally drifted towards sleep, her mind already 3 moves ahead, already seeing how this would unfold. Outside, the November rain intensified, drumming against the windows like fingers tapping out a rhythm. In 48 hours, Rebecca Chen's world would begin to unravel. In 72 hours, she'd be suspended pending investigation. In a week, her career at Mass General would be over. The protocol had been activated, and Margaret Hawthorne never missed. If you want to know how a retired CIA operative systematically dismantles someone's entire life without ever leaving a hospital bed, make sure to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and share this story with someone who loves incredible tales of justice and intrigue. Because what happens next will show you just how dangerous it can be to underestimate the elderly woman in room 347. The game has just begun, and Rebecca Chen has no idea she's already lost. Margaret woke at 6:30, as she'd done every morning for 40 years, regardless of geography or circumstance. The hospital was beginning its daily transformation from the hushed intimacy of night shift to the organized chaos of day. She heard the medication cart making its rounds, the distant clatter of breakfast trays being loaded, voices gradually rising in volume as a new army of nurses, doctors, and support staff began their assault on illness and injury. She pressed the call button and waited. 3 minutes later, she'd timed it. A young nurse named Diane Parker entered. Diane was 26, enthusiastic, still idealistic enough to actually make eye contact with patients and ask how they were feeling, as if she genuinely cared. Margaret had identified her on day 1 as a perfect instrument. "Good morning, Mrs. Hawthorne. How did you sleep?" Diane's blonde ponytail bounced with her energy. "Oh, not well, dear, not well at all." Margaret arranged her features into worried confusion. "I had the strangest dream. Someone was in my room going through my things. It felt so real." Diane checked the monitors, making soothing noises. "Sometimes the pain medication can cause vivid dreams, nothing to worry about." "Perhaps you're right." Margaret paused, then added with perfect elderly vagueness, "Though I do seem to be missing some money. But maybe I spent it before I came in." My memory these days. She waved a hand dismissively. Would you like me to check your drawer? Diane asked, already moving toward the bedside table. Oh, would you? You're such a sweet girl. Diane opened the drawer, surveying the contents. I see your glasses, a book, but I don't see a wallet. Did you have one when you were admitted? I thought so, but maybe... Margaret trailed off, looking troubled. I don't want to be a bother. I'm sure it will turn up, or maybe I'm just imagining things. Let me make a note in your chart, just in case, Diane said, her young face creased with concern. And I'll mention it to the charge nurse. Oh, you don't have to... It's no trouble at all, Mrs. Hawthorne. We want you to feel safe here. Seed planted. Margaret thanked her profusely, playing the grateful elderly patient perfectly. Diane left with a promise to check back later, and Margaret settled in to wait. The beauty of the protocol was patience. She didn't need to do much. Just create small ripples and let human nature do the rest. By 9 o'clock, Carol Martinez, the head nurse, stopped by. Carol was 52, Puerto Rican, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen everything twice and had patience for nothing that threatened her floor's smooth operation. Mrs. Hawthorne, Diane mentioned you might be missing some personal items. Margaret went through her confused routine again, this time adding, But I really can't be sure, dear. My mind isn't what it used to be. Someone was in my room last night, but it might have been a dream. Or maybe it was the night nurse doing her rounds. There was definitely someone here around midnight. I remember looking at the clock. Carol's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw the slight tension in her jaw. Unauthorized room entries during patient sleep hours were a serious protocol violation, even if they were just for routine checks. Which nurse was on duty last night? Margaret asked innocently. The young Asian woman. She's always so busy, poor thing. I see her taking extra shifts all the time. Nurse Chen, Carol said, her voice carefully neutral. Yes, such a hard worker. Is she in today? She is, Carol made a note on her tablet. Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm going to have security review the camera footage from last night, just to be thorough, for your peace of mind. Oh, I don't want to cause any trouble. It's protocol, Carol assured her, but Margaret could hear the shift in tone. Carol Martinez was now in problem-solving mode, which meant she'd be watching her staff more carefully, looking for anything out of place. After Carol left, Margaret allowed herself a small smile. The hospital's cameras had blind spots, but they would show Rebecca entering the room at 12:17 a.m., staying for approximately 90 seconds, and leaving. That wouldn't be conclusive evidence of theft. Rebecca could claim she was checking on a patient, but it would establish opportunity. Combined with the missing wallet, it would plant doubt. Phase 2 was proceeding exactly as planned. The morning passed slowly. Margaret had never been good at idleness. 30 years in the field had trained her to always be moving, thinking, planning. Retirement had been a special kind of torture, the sudden absence of purpose like a limb amputated without anesthesia. She'd tried to fill the emptiness with books, with volunteering at the Boston Public Library, with the fiction of a normal life. But normal had never fit her quite right. Her daughter Emily had understood that, even if she'd never understood why. The last time they'd spoken, 12 years ago, at Emily's wedding that Margaret had almost missed because of a mission in Istanbul, Emily had looked at her with exhausted frustration and said, "You were never really here, Mum. Even when you were physically present, you were somewhere else. I don't even know who you really are." Margaret had wanted to explain that she didn't know who she really was either, that after 3 decades of being other people, her own identity had become just another cover story. But Emily was walking down the aisle toward her new husband, toward a life that didn't include a mother who'd missed dance recitals and graduations and ordinary moments because she was too busy saving the world in ways she could never explain. The door opened, interrupting her thoughts. Rebecca Chen entered, and for the first time Margaret saw tension in her movements. The nurse's smile was professional, but strained. "How are you feeling this morning, Mrs. Hawthorne?" "A bit anxious, actually," Margaret said, watching Rebecca's face carefully. "I seem to have misplaced my wallet. You haven't seen it, have you, dear?" Rebecca's expression didn't change, but Margaret noticed the microsecond of hesitation, the slight dilation of pupils that indicated stress. "No, I haven't. Have you reported it?" "Oh, the head nurse is looking into it. She mentioned checking camera footage." Margaret delivered the line with perfect elderly innocence, but she saw it land. Rebecca's hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, just a flutter of movement, quickly suppressed, but enough. "I'm sure it will turn up," Rebecca said, her voice a shade too casual. "Things get misplaced in hospitals all the time." "I hope so. Although—" Margaret paused, as if struggling to remember. "I do recall waking up last night and seeing someone in my room. Was that you, dear, around midnight?" Rebecca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I may have checked on you during my rounds. It's standard procedure." Of course. You're all so attentive here." Margaret smiled warmly, then added with devastating casualness, "I just hope the cameras show who was in here. For everyone's protection, you know." Rebecca completed her check with mechanical efficiency and left quickly. Margaret could see the wheels turning behind those calculating eyes. Rebecca was smart enough to realize she might be in trouble, but not experienced enough to know just how much trouble she was actually in. The afternoon brought Dr. Rashid for his rounds. Dr. Amir Rashid was 45, Pakistani-American, brilliant and slightly pompous, with the kind of perfectionism that made him an excellent doctor and a difficult colleague. Margaret had overheard him reprimanding Rebecca twice about minor charting errors, nothing serious, but enough to establish a history. "Mrs. Hawthorne, your recovery is progressing well," he said, reviewing her chart. "We should be able to discharge you in a few days." "That's wonderful news, Doctor." Margaret hesitated, then added, "Although I have been having some confusion, short-term memory issues. I keep thinking someone took my wallet, but I can't be sure if that really happened or if it's the medication." Dr. Rashid frowned. "What medication are you referring to?" "The sleeping pills. The night nurse gave me something around midnight that made me very drowsy. I can barely remember anything after that." Rashid's frown deepened. He pulled out his tablet and scrolled through her medical records. "You're not prescribed any sleeping medication, Mrs. Hawthorne. Who administered this?" "The young woman. Chinese, I think. Very busy, always in a hurry." "Nurse Chen." Rashid's voice had gone cold. Administering unauthorized medication was a serious violation, potentially grounds for immediate termination. "I'll need to follow up on this immediately." "Oh, I'm sure it was just a mistake." But Rashid was already making notes, his expression set in the grim determination of someone who'd found a protocol violation. He left without his usual pleasantries, and Margaret knew he'd go straight to Carol Martinez. By evening, the atmosphere on the floor had shifted noticeably. Margaret observed it all from her bed, the hushed conversation between Carol and Dr. Rashid outside the nurses' station, their glances toward Rebecca's back as she worked, the way other nurses began giving Rebecca slightly wider berth, the way conversations quieted when she approached. The web was tightening. Rebecca appeared at 7 for the shift change, and Margaret could see the strain showing now. Dark circles under her eyes, movements less fluid, a defensiveness in her posture that hadn't been there yesterday. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Rebecca said, her voice tight. "Dr. Rashid had some questions about medication administered last night. I never gave you any sleeping pills." "Oh dear," Margaret said, looking distressed. "Did I imagine that? I'm so sorry. I could have sworn, but my memory—" She let tears well up in her eyes, a trick she'd learned from a Moscow actress in 1987. "I don't know what's real anymore." Rebecca's face softened slightly, seeing only a confused elderly woman. She didn't see the operator, the strategist, the woman who'd spent 30 years reading people like open books and writing their fates with invisible ink. "It's okay, Mrs. Hawthorne. The medication you're on can cause confusion. Don't worry about it." But Rebecca did worry. Margaret could see it in every line of her body as she left the room. The nurse was beginning to realize she was under scrutiny, that her actions were being questioned, that the professional foundation she'd built was suddenly unstable. What Rebecca didn't understand, what she couldn't understand, was that this was only the beginning. Margaret hadn't even deployed her full arsenal yet. She'd simply created an environment where people were watching, questioning, doubting. The actual destruction would come from Rebecca's own responses to that pressure, the mistakes she'd make while trying to defend herself, the ways she'd alienate potential allies through defensiveness and paranoia. The protocol didn't destroy people directly. It created conditions where people destroyed themselves. As night fell over Boston, and the hospital settled into its quiet evening rhythm. Margaret lay in her bed and wondered, not for the first time, whether she was doing the right thing. Rebecca Chen had stolen $73 and a credit card. Did that really warrant what Margaret was unleashing? But then she remembered Rebecca's face when she'd taken the wallet, not desperate, not guilty, just coldly opportunistic. The face of someone who saw a vulnerable target and took what they wanted because they thought there would be no consequences. In Margaret's world, there were always consequences. What do you think of the story so far? Is Margaret justified in what she's doing, or is she going too far? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because the next chapter is where things get truly intense. Rebecca's world is about to come crashing down, and the methods Margaret uses will leave you speechless. Rebecca Chen's third shift since the wallet incident began with a summons to Carol Martinez's office. She sat across from the head nurse, Dr. Rashid, and Tom Bradley from hospital security, a heavy-set man in his 50s with the tired eyes of someone who'd investigated too many petty thefts and insurance frauds. "We've reviewed the security footage from Wednesday night," Carol began, her voice professionally neutral, but her eyes sharp. "You entered Mrs. Hawthorne's room at 12:17 a.m. and remained for approximately 90 seconds. Can you explain the purpose of that visit?" Rebecca's prepared answer came quickly. "I was doing routine rounds. I checked her vitals, made sure she was comfortable." "There's no notation in her chart about a midnight check," Dr. Rashid observed, scrolling through his tablet. "It was brief. I didn't think it warranted documentation." Tom Bradley leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "Mrs. Hawthorne's wallet was in that room Wednesday night. By Thursday morning, it was gone. You understand why that's concerning." Rebecca felt her face flush. "Are you accusing me of stealing from a patient?" "We're asking questions," Carol said. "Mrs. Hawthorne also mentioned receiving sleeping medication that night, medication that wasn't prescribed." "I never gave her any medication. She's confused. She's elderly and on multiple drugs. Of course she's confused." The words came out sharper than Rebecca intended, edged with frustration. She saw the glances exchanged between Carol and Dr. Rashid, saw them making judgments about her character, her professionalism. This was exactly what she'd feared when she took that wallet. Not getting caught. She'd been careful enough to avoid that, but the scrutiny, the suspicion, the way her colleagues would look at her. "Rebecca," Carol said, and the use of her first name made everything worse somehow, more personal, more damning. "Your work has been exemplary until this week, but there have been concerns. The charting errors Dr. Rashid mentioned. The fact that you're working excessive overtime." "I'm picking up shifts because I need the money," Rebecca said, hating the defensive edge in her voice. "That's not a crime. No one said it was." Tom Bradley opened a folder. "But financial pressure can lead people to make poor choices. I need to ask, do you have Mrs. Hawthorne's wallet?" Rebecca looked him straight in the eyes. "No, I don't." It was technically true. She'd already disposed of it, cut into pieces and scattered across 3 different dumpsters throughout Boston. The cash was hidden in her apartment, the credit card destroyed. But the lie of omission sat like lead in her stomach. "Then you won't mind if we search your locker," Tom said. It wasn't really a question. 20 minutes later, after they'd found nothing because she wasn't stupid enough to keep evidence, Rebecca returned to her rounds with her hands shaking and her career hanging by a thread. She'd been temporarily reassigned to administrative duties pending investigation, which was code for suspended in all but name. She passed Mrs. Hawthorne's room and saw the elderly woman reading by the window, looking peaceful and harmless. Rebecca felt a surge of anger. This was all because a confused old woman had misplaced her wallet and blamed the nearest convenient target. If she'd known what Margaret Hawthorne really was, that anger would have curdled into terror. Inside room 347, Margaret set down her book, the Graham Greene she'd been reading when she fell, brought by a volunteer from her home, and allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. Phase 3 was proceeding flawlessly. Rebecca was now under official investigation, isolated from her co-workers, defensive and making mistakes. The amateur mistakes of someone under pressure who wasn't trained to handle operational stress. Margaret had spent 3 decades under stress that would have shattered most people, had learned to function normally while maintaining multiple identities, while running agents in hostile territory, while one wrong word could mean death or worse. Rebecca Chen, with her obvious tells and emotional reactions, wouldn't last a week. But something unexpected happened that afternoon, something that cracked the perfect machinery of Margaret's protocol. A visitor arrived. A small Asian woman in her 60s, frail and moving slowly, pushed in a wheelchair by a hospital volunteer. She was brought to the visitors' lounge, where Rebecca met her during her lunch break. Margaret watched through the window of her room as Rebecca knelt beside the wheelchair, holding the woman's hand, speaking urgently. Margaret used the call button. When Diane arrived, Margaret asked with carefully crafted concern, "That woman in the wheelchair, is she all right? She looks so unwell." Diane glanced toward the lounge. "Oh, that's Mrs. Chen, Rebecca's mother. She has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Rebecca brings her to visit during breaks when she's having good days." The information hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd known Rebecca was under financial pressure. The overtime, the frayed clothes, the desperation in her eyes, but she hadn't connected the dots, hadn't dug deep enough to understand why. "How terrible," Margaret murmured. "The treatment must be so expensive." "Astronomical," Diane said, her young face troubled. "Rebecca's been picking up every shift she can to help cover costs. Insurance doesn't pay for everything, you know. Some of the experimental treatments her mom needs." She shook her head. "I don't know how Rebecca's managing." After Diane left, Margaret sat in silence, staring at the two women in the lounge. Rebecca was crying now, her head resting on her mother's lap, the older woman stroking her daughter's hair with trembling hands. It was a portrait of desperation and love, of someone carrying a burden that was crushing her. Margaret had seen people under impossible pressure before. She'd exploited it, used it, turned it into leverage for her missions. A corrupt official with gambling debts, a scientist with a sick child, a secretary in love with the wrong person. Everyone had a pressure point, a place where they were vulnerable, where they could be pushed into making choices they'd never otherwise make. She'd never questioned it before. It was just operational reality, the necessary calculus of intelligence work. But looking at Rebecca Chen sobbing in that wheelchair-accessible lounge, holding her dying mother's hand, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in decades of service. Doubt. Rebecca had stolen the wallet, that was fact. But she hadn't done it out of pure greed or cruelty. She'd done it because she was drowning, because the American healthcare system was grinding her into dust, because she was watching her mother die and would do anything, even compromise her ethics, to buy a few more months, a few more days. Margaret thought of Emily, her daughter who she hadn't spoken to in 12 years. Emily, who'd needed her mother at dance recitals and graduations and ordinary moments, and instead got a ghost who was always somewhere else, always choosing the mission over her own child. What kind of person did that? What kind of person chose abstract concepts like national security over concrete relationships? What kind of person destroyed others systematically, professionally, without remorse, and called it duty? The same kind of person who was currently destroying a desperate woman whose only crime was loving her mother too much. Margaret pressed the call button again. When Carol Martinez arrived, Margaret said something she'd never said in any mission, in any operation in 30 years of service. "I made a mistake." Carol's eyebrows rose. "I'm sorry. My wallet. I found it. It had fallen behind the drawer somehow, wedged against the wall. I'm so sorry to have caused all this trouble." Carol stared at her. "Mrs. Hawthorne, we have security footage of a nurse doing her job, checking on a patient in the middle of the night," Margaret interrupted firmly. "I was confused. The medication, you understand. I imagined things. There was no theft. There was no unauthorized medication. There was just an elderly woman with a foggy memory causing problems. But you were very certain before. I was wrong." Margaret met Carol's eyes with the full force of decades of conviction, the unshakable certainty of someone who'd lied to hostile intelligence services and made them believe every word. "I'm old. I'm recovering from a head injury, and I was confused. That poor girl doesn't deserve to have her career destroyed because I misplaced my own property." Carol studied her for a long moment. "You understand that making false accusations is serious. It's wasted hospital resources, damaged a staff member's reputation. I understand completely, and I take full responsibility. Please extend my deepest apologies to Nurse Chen." After Carol left, clearly bewildered by the sudden reversal, Margaret sat in her bed and wondered what the hell she'd just done. She'd aborted the protocol, something she'd never done, not once in her entire career. Missions were absolute. Once initiated, you saw them through to completion. That was the rule. But she wasn't on a mission anymore. She was a retired operative in a hospital bed, and the target wasn't a foreign intelligence officer or a terrorist or a corrupt official. It was a desperate nurse trying to save her mother's life. Maybe that was the difference. Maybe that was what she'd lost somewhere along the way. The ability to see that not everything was a mission, that not every enemy was an enemy, that sometimes people did wrong things for right reasons and deserved mercy instead of destruction. Evening came. Rebecca Chen appeared at her door for the shift change, looking exhausted and weary. Margaret could see she'd been crying. "Nurse Chen," Margaret said gently, "I owe you an apology." Rebecca's head snapped up, surprise evident on her face. "I found my wallet. It had fallen behind the drawer. I'm so sorry for the trouble I caused you. There was no theft, no wrongdoing on your part. I was just a confused old woman, and you were doing your job perfectly." Rebecca stood frozen in the doorway, clearly trying to process this unexpected development. Her eyes searched Margaret's face, looking for deception, for the trap. "I heard about your mother," Margaret continued softly. "I'm so sorry for what you're going through. I can't imagine how difficult that must be." That broke something in Rebecca. She sank into the chair beside Margaret's bed, all the professional armor falling away, leaving just an exhausted woman at the end of her rope. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Rebecca whispered. "The treatments are bankrupting me. I've taken every extra shift, borrowed from everyone I know, maxed out my credit cards. And she's still dying. Slowly, painfully. And there's nothing I can do except watch and go broke trying to buy her a few more months." Margaret reached out and took Rebecca's hand. The young nurse flinched but didn't pull away. "I understand more than you know," Margaret said quietly. "I spent my whole life making choices I thought were necessary, sacrificing relationships, sacrificing my humanity sometimes, because I believed in something bigger than myself. And now, I'm alone in a hospital room and my daughter won't speak to me, and I have to ask myself what it was all for." They sat in silence for a moment, two women from completely different worlds, connected by the universal experience of impossible choices and their consequences. "Did you take my wallet, Rebecca?" The question hung in the air. Rebecca's face went through a dozen emotions: fear, shame, defiance, exhaustion, before settling on something like resignation. "Yes," she whispered. "I did. And I'm so sorry. I've never done anything like that before. I'm not that person. But I looked at you sleeping and I thought about my mother dying and the bills piling up, and I just needed something to go right. Something to be easy. Just this once." "I understand," Margaret said. And she did. Because she'd made Rebecca into that person, had taken a basically good woman under impossible pressure and tested her until she broke. She'd done the same thing to dozens of people in her career, had broken them systematically for reasons of state. But this time she'd done it for $73 and wounded pride. "I'm going to turn myself in," Rebecca said, standing up. "I'll tell Carol everything. I deserve whatever happens." "No." Margaret's voice had the command tone she'd used to run agents in hostile territory. Rebecca stopped. "You're going to forget this conversation happened. You're going to keep being an excellent nurse, and you're going to focus on your mother. That's an order." "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand. You just need to trust me. Can you do that?" Rebecca studied her face, seeing something there she couldn't quite identify. Finally, she nodded. After Rebecca left, Margaret lay in the darkness and thought about mercy. Mercy was a luxury she'd never been able to afford in her career. Mercy meant blown operations, compromised agents, intelligence failures that cost lives. But she wasn't in the field anymore. She was just an old woman in a hospital bed, and mercy was the only mission that mattered. Thank you so much for staying with this story until now. I know it's taken some unexpected turns, but I promise you, the best is still to come. What Margaret does next will restore your faith in humanity and show you that even the coldest warriors can find redemption. Don't go anywhere. The next morning, Margaret made a phone call. She had numbers in her contacts that most people couldn't imagine, numbers that connected to offices without names, to people who officially didn't exist, to networks that operated in the shadows of legitimate government. Most of those contacts were dead now or retired like herself, but some remained, and some owed her favors that had never expired. She called a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. It rang twice before a man's voice answered, gravelly with age but still sharp. "This is a surprise," the voice said. "No names, never names on open lines, even after all these years." "I need a favor," Margaret said. "After Budapest, you have more than favors. You have carte blanche. What do you need?" Margaret thought about Budapest 1989. The operation that had gone sideways, the extraction that shouldn't have worked, the man on the other end of this line who would have died in a Hungarian prison if Margaret hadn't pulled off something impossible. He'd risen through the ranks since then, was now high up in the agency's financial operations division. Perfect for what she needed. "I need an anonymous donation to be made to a specific person. Clean money, nothing traceable back to anyone. Enough to cover advanced cancer treatment for approximately 6 to 8 months, plus living expenses. Call it $200,000. There was a pause. That's a very specific amount for a very specific purpose. Personal matter. Very personal. And it needs to be structured, so the recipient believes it's coming from a legitimate charitable foundation. Something cancer-related. Make it believable." "Done. I'll have the foundation paperwork drawn up by end of day. Deposit will clear within 72 hours. Anything else?" Margaret hesitated. "Actually, yes. There's a nurse at Mass General, Rebecca Chen. Clean record, good at her job, recently underwent an investigation for something she didn't do. The lie came easily. Decades of practice. She deserves a clean slate. Can you make sure nothing from this week appears in any employment background checks?" "Consider it handled. Maggie, are you all right?" "This isn't like you." "I'm fine, I'm just tired. And trying to fix something I broke." After she hung up, Margaret stared out the window at Boston spreading before her, grey and cold in the November morning. She'd spent 30 years breaking things for her country, people, organizations, governments. Maybe it was time to use those same skills, those same connections to fix something instead. 3 days later, Rebecca Chen received a certified letter from the American Cancer Research Foundation. She opened it during her lunch break, and when she read the contents, she had to sit down because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "Dear Miss Chen, it is our pleasure to inform you that your mother, Li-Ming Chen, has been selected to receive a full grant covering all experimental treatments for pancreatic cancer through our research trials program. This grant includes all medical expenses, medications, and supportive care for the duration of treatment, with no financial obligation to your family. Additionally, you have been awarded a caregiver support stipend of $50,000 to assist with living expenses during this difficult time. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange the treatment protocol with Dr. Sarah Morrison at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute." The letter continued with details, contact information, legal disclaimers. But Rebecca had stopped reading after the first paragraph. She sat in the break room with tears streaming down her face, holding this impossible miracle in her shaking hands. That evening, she burst into room 347, where Margaret was watching the news. "Did you do this?" Rebecca demanded, the letter clutched in her hand. "Somehow did you make this happen?" Margaret looked up with perfect innocent confusion. "Do what, dear?" "This." Rebecca thrust the letter at her. "This foundation, this grant. It's too coincidental. Right after our conversation, right after everything that happened. Did you do this?" Margaret read the letter carefully, taking her time. When she looked up, her face showed nothing but gentle pleasure. "This is wonderful news, Rebecca. Your mother is being given a chance. But I'm just an elderly woman in a hospital bed. How could I possibly arrange something like this? I don't know, but I don't believe in coincidences this big." "Then believe in miracles instead," Margaret said softly. "Or better yet, don't question it. Just accept the gift and focus on your mother. She needs you." Rebecca sank into the chair, the fight draining out of her. I can't accept this if it came from you. I stole from you. I don't deserve... Rebecca! Margaret's voice had that command tone again, the one that came from decades of running operations. You made a mistake under impossible pressure. You've learned from it. Now you're being given a second chance. Take it. Use it. Be the person you actually are, not the person desperation forced you to become. But, no buts. This is how the world works sometimes. Bad things happen to good people, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, good things happen to balance it out. This is your balance. Take it. Rebecca sat in silence for a long moment, then whispered, Thank you. If you did do this, thank you. If you didn't, thank you for listening and understanding. You're welcome, Margaret said. Now go call that doctor and set up your mother's treatment. That's an order. After Rebecca left, Margaret allowed herself a rare smile. It felt strange on her face, unfamiliar after years of careful neutral expressions. She'd just spent $200,000, money she'd accumulated over decades of careful investing, money she'd planned to leave to Emily if her daughter ever forgave her enough to accept it. But this felt better somehow, more immediate, more real. She picked up her phone and called another number. This one belonged to a private investigator in Boston, a former FBI agent who did discreet work for discreet clients. I need you to compile a complete dossier on someone, Margaret said. Rebecca Chen, nurse at Mass General Hospital. Everything. Her life, her struggles, her character. And then I need you to write a letter from me to my daughter, explaining what I did and why. Can you do that? Of course. What's the purpose? Margaret thought about Emily, about 12 years of silence, about all the moments she'd missed chasing shadows across the world. The purpose is to show my daughter that I'm finally learning, that it's possible to change, even for someone like me, even after everything. The investigator promised to have the dossier and letter ready within a week. Margaret thanked him and hung up. She had one more call to make, this one to the hospital administration, to formally compliment the care she'd received, and specifically to mention how professional and compassionate Nurse Rebecca Chen had been throughout her stay. It would go into Rebecca's file, help counterbalance any lingering questions from the investigation. As Margaret looked out at Boston's evening skyline, lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, she thought about the HONEYTRAP protocol. She'd initiated it to destroy Rebecca Chen, had executed the first phases flawlessly. But then she'd done something unprecedented. She'd reversed it, turned it from a weapon of destruction into a tool of salvation. Maybe that was the real power of the protocol. Not the ability to tear people down, but the understanding of human psychology that could also build people up, support them, give them what they needed to survive. It was a lesson that had taken her 30 years and countless casualties to learn. But perhaps finally, she was becoming more than just a weapon pointed at whatever target her country designated. Perhaps she was becoming human again. The story is almost at its end, but please stay with us to see how this remarkable tale concludes. If you're still watching, it means you're invested in Margaret's journey from cold operative to compassionate human being. If this story is touching you the way I hope it is, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. We have more incredible stories coming that will move you, challenge you, and remind you of the best parts of humanity. Don't miss what happens in the final chapter. Margaret was discharged from Mass General on a grey Tuesday morning in late November. Her hip had healed well enough for her to manage with a cane, and Dr. Rashid had certified her fit for release with instructions for physical therapy and follow-up appointments. Rebecca Chen was there to help her pack her few belongings, and the dynamic between them had shifted into something neither woman quite knew how to name. Your mother starts treatment next week, Margaret asked as Rebecca folded her nightgowns. Monday morning at Dana-Farber. Dr. Morrison says the experimental protocol has shown promising results in trials. It's not a cure, but it could give her months, maybe longer. Rebecca's voice was thick with emotion. I still can't believe it's real. Believe it, Margaret said firmly, and make every moment count. A hospital volunteer arrived with a wheelchair, protocol for all discharged patients, regardless of mobility, and Rebecca pushed Margaret through the familiar corridors she'd navigated for the past week and a half. They passed the nurses' station, where Carol Martinez waved goodbye, past the supply closets and blind spots Margaret had catalogued on her first day, through the main lobby with its autumn decorations and information desk. A taxi waited at the patient pickup area. Margaret had arranged it the night before, declining Rebecca's offer to drive her home. Some distances needed to be maintained, some boundaries preserved. They said their goodbyes in the cold November air, breath visible in the morning chill. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Rebecca said as Margaret prepared to slide into the taxi, "I don't know what you did or how you did it, but I know you did something, and I want you to know that I'm going to pay it forward, however I can for the rest of my life. I'm going to be the kind of person who deserves what you gave me." Margaret touched Rebecca's cheek gently. "You already are that person. You just forgot for a moment. We all forget sometimes who we really are. The trick is remembering before it's too late." The taxi pulled away from Mass General, carrying Margaret back toward her Beacon Hill townhouse. She watched the hospital recede in the side mirror until it disappeared behind a corner, another chapter closed in a life full of chapters she could never speak about to anyone. Her townhouse was exactly as she'd left it, a narrow brick building on a quiet street, lined with gas lamps and history. 3 stories of carefully curated emptiness, books she'd collected from a dozen countries, art she'd acquired under a dozen names, furniture that was elegant and expensive, and somehow still made the place feel like a very tasteful mausoleum. She climbed the front steps carefully, her hip protesting each movement, and let herself into the silence. The first thing she did was call the private investigator. "Is the package ready?" "Completed yesterday. Dossier on Rebecca Chen and your letter to your daughter. Should I messenger it over?" "No. Give me the address. I'll deliver it myself." Emily lived in Portland, Oregon now. She was a high school English teacher, married to a man named David who was a software engineer. Mother to 2 children Margaret had never met, a boy named Jack who was 8, and a girl named Sophie who was 6. Margaret knew all of this from periodic searches she'd conducted over the years, from the distance of someone who no longer had the right to know such things firsthand. The investigator gave her Emily's address. Margaret thanked him, paid his fee with a wire transfer, and then sat in her kitchen looking at the phone number she'd had for 12 years, but never called. It took her 3 hours to work up the courage, 3 hours of pacing, of making tea she didn't drink, of rehearsing words that kept falling apart before she could speak them. Finally, at 2 in the afternoon, Boston time, 11 a.m. in Portland, she dialed. The phone rang 4 times. Margaret almost hung up. Then a voice answered, one she hadn't heard in over a decade but would have recognized anywhere. "Hello? Emily, it's your mother." Silence. Long enough that Margaret thought the call had dropped. Then, "Mom." "Yes. I know I have no right to call after all this time. I know I don't deserve to be heard. But I need to tell you something. And then if you want me to never call again, I'll respect that." Another silence. Then, cautiously, "I'm listening." Margaret told her everything. About the hospital, about Rebecca Chen, about the wallet and the protocol, and the moment when she'd looked at a desperate woman and seen her own daughter looking back at her. About the money she'd spent to save Rebecca's mother, the second chance she'd given to someone who'd wronged her. About finally understanding what she'd spent 30 years failing to understand, that mercy mattered more than missions, that human connection was worth more than operational success. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Margaret said when the story was finished. "I'm just asking you to know that I finally understand what I did to you, what I didn't give you when you needed me. I can't change the past, Emily, but I'm trying to be different for whatever future I have left." Emily was crying. Margaret could hear it in her breathing, in the catch in her voice when she finally spoke. "You spent $200,000 on a stranger's mother, but you missed my wedding because you were in Istanbul doing something you couldn't tell me about. I know. You gave a woman you barely knew a second chance, but you never gave me a first chance to really know who you are." "I know. Do you? Do you really understand what it was like growing up with a mother who was a ghost, who I couldn't rely on, who I couldn't tell my friends about, who missed everything that mattered because she was off being a hero to people I'd never meet?" "I'm beginning to," Margaret said quietly. And I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so profoundly sorry. More silence. Then, I have 2 kids now, Jack and Sophie. They ask about you sometimes. I tell them their grandmother is very busy and lives far away. I don't know what else to say. Margaret's throat tightened. What do you want to say? I don't know. I'm angry at you, Mom. I've been angry for 12 years, but I miss you. I miss having a mother. Even if she was never really there, at least she existed. Now I have kids of my own, and I realize how hard it is, how many ways you can fail even when you're trying your best. And I wonder if maybe you were trying your best too, in your own broken way. I was, Margaret whispered. But my best wasn't good enough. I chose wrong over and over. I chose the work over you. I told myself I was making the world safer for your generation, but really, I was just hiding from being a real person with real relationships. It was easier to be a spy than a mother. Why are you calling now? Why after all this time? Because I'm 67 years old, and I'm running out of time to fix the things I broke. And because I saw myself in that hospital, cold, calculating, ready to destroy someone for a minor slight, and I finally understood what a monster I'd become. I don't want to die as that person, Emily. I want to die as your mother, if you'll let me. Emily's crying had quieted to occasional sniffles. I need time. I can't just forgive everything because you had an epiphany in a hospital. You weren't there for my entire childhood. You weren't there for my wedding. You've never met your grandchildren. That doesn't go away with one phone call. I know I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness. I'm just asking for a door that isn't completely closed, a possibility that someday, maybe, we could try again. I'll think about it, Emily said finally. That's all I can promise right now. I'll think about it. That's more than I deserve, thank you. They talked for a few more minutes, awkward, halting conversation about Emily's job, her kids, the weather in Portland. Normal things that felt extraordinary after 12 years of silence. When they finally hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen and cried for the first time in decades. She cried for the daughter she'd failed, for the relationship she'd sacrificed, for the grandchildren who didn't know her. She cried for Rebecca Chen and all the other people she'd manipulated over the years, some for good reasons and some for reasons that seemed good at the time. She cried for the woman she'd been and the woman she was trying to become. The next morning, she packaged up the dossier on Rebecca Chen, a document that told the story of a good person pushed to desperate measures, a story of redemption and second chances. She wrote a letter to accompany it. Emily, this is the story of a woman I nearly destroyed, and then chose to save instead. I'm sending it to you because I want you to understand that I'm trying to learn from my mistakes. I'm trying to be more than what I was. If you decide you can't have me in your life, I'll understand. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to try, I'll be here. I'll be the grandmother your children deserve. I'll be the mother I should have been to you. I love you. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it properly. Mum. She mailed the package to Portland and then began the long work of rehabilitation, not just physical therapy for her hip, but the deeper work of rebuilding a life based on connection instead of isolation, on mercy instead of calculation. 2 weeks later, she received an email from Emily. Just 3 sentences. Jack's school play is December 15th at 7 p.m. He's playing a tree in the winter scene. If you want to come, I'll send you the address. Margaret bought a plane ticket that afternoon. On the day of the play, she sat in the back row of a Portland elementary school auditorium, watching her grandson portray a tree with the kind of serious dedication only an 8-year-old could bring to such a role. Emily sat 3 rows ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure Margaret was still there. After the play, they all went for ice cream. Margaret, Emily, David, Jack and Sophie. The children were shy at first, this stranger grandmother they'd heard about but never met. But Margaret had decades of experience making people comfortable, of reading situations and adapting her behavior. This time, though, she used those skills not to manipulate, but to connect. She asked Sophie about her favorite books. She listened to Jack describe his tree performance in detail. She watched Emily watching her, saw the cautious hope in her daughter's eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. As Margaret flew back to Boston that night, she thought about the HONEYTRAP protocol, about 30 years of operations, about all the skills she'd accumulated in service of her country. She'd spent her entire career learning how to break people, how to exploit their weaknesses, how to turn them against each other. But maybe, finally, she was learning how to use those same skills to heal instead of hurt, to build instead of destroy. Maybe that was the real mission all along. Not the one her country had given her, but the one she'd had to discover for herself. She was 67 years old, living on a hip that would never be quite right again, estranged from her only child, having spent her life in ways she could never fully explain or justify. But she'd given Rebecca Chen a second chance. She'd reconnected with Emily. She'd met her grandchildren. She'd chosen mercy over vengeance, compassion over calculation. It wasn't enough to erase 30 years of choices. Nothing could do that. But it was something, a step toward redemption, a beginning of wisdom earned too late, but perhaps just in time. 3 months later, she received a Christmas card from Rebecca Chen. Inside was a photo of Rebecca and her mother at Dana-Farber, both smiling, Li Ming looking healthier than she had in the hospital. The treatment was working. They had time. The card read simply, "Thank you for teaching me that mistakes don't define us. What we do after the mistake is what matters. Merry Christmas, from 2 women you gave a second chance." Margaret put the card on her mantel next to a photo Emily had sent her, the 4 of them at the ice cream shop, Sophie sitting on Margaret's lap, Jack showing her something on his phone, Emily smiling in the background. She looked at both images for a long time, these testaments to the possibility of change, the power of mercy, the idea that even the coldest hearts could thaw if given enough reason. Then she picked up her phone and called Emily. "Hello? Hi, sweetheart. I was wondering if you'd like to come visit Boston for spring break. I'd love to show Jack and Sophie the Freedom Trail, the aquarium, all the historical sites, and maybe we could just spend time together. The 4 of you and me, if you'd like." There was a pause. Then Emily said, with warmth that had been absent for 12 years, "I'd like that, Mum. We'd all like that." And Margaret Hawthorne, former CIA operative, expert in psychological manipulation, wielder of the HONEYTRAP protocol, sat in her Beacon Hill townhouse and smiled. She'd spent 30 years breaking things for her country. Now she was finally learning how to fix things for herself. And that, she realized, was the most important mission of all. Thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible journey. Margaret's story reminds us that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose compassion over calculation, never too late to repair the bridges we've burned. What did you think of this story? Did Margaret do the right thing in the end? Have you ever gotten a second chance from someone when you didn't deserve it? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And please, tell us your name and what city and state you're watching from. We love knowing where our viewers are and hearing your perspectives from all over the country. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next incredible tale. We have more stories of extraordinary people living ordinary lives, stories that will make you think, make you feel, and remind you of the best parts of humanity. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about second chances and redemption. Leave a like if you believe everyone deserves the opportunity to change. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, remember, we're all capable of more than we think, both more harm and more healing. The choice is always ours.